Hello, I'm Chuck Martin, and welcome to the Voices of the Internet of Things. With me today is Grady Irey, Vice President of Data Science at Arity, a telematics and Internet of Things company founded by Allstate. Grady has been Field Product Manager for Allstate, Vice President of Product at Allstate, and Vice President of Product at Arity. At Arity, Grady oversees the Data Science and Analytics Group, where he and his team are responsible for business analytics, rating services, and all data science supporting the Arity platform. Welcome here, Grady.
Thank you, Chuck. Happy to be with you.
So tell me what a data scientist is up to these days.
So at Arity, a data scientist is up to working with some of the largest and most interesting data sets that we've come to understand or see over the past few years. Arity is a company founded by Allstate, traditionally an insurance company where data science was about actuarial science, is now working with huge amounts of telematics data to the amount of a billion miles a month collected, and using that telematics data to understand mobility.
Where do you get that data?
So we get the data from a number of different sources, but in all cases, it's really coming from a vehicle itself. Whether that technology that affords the data transfer is embedded in the vehicle technology, or whether it's a hardware device that's plugged into the OBD2 port, or whether it's a phone in possession of the driver with our software running on it. All of those configurations enable the collection of data that helps us to understand mobility and understand risk.
How long have you been collecting this much data? It sounds like a lot of data.
It is a lot of data, and we've been collecting it since about the better part of the last decade, since about 2010.
So how much do you have?
We have a lot, more than 30 billion miles collected. And it's a mixture of the different modes that I described. So some of it coming from hardware devices and embedded technology, and some coming from our proprietary software that can be downloaded in a mobile app.
So is any of this tracking come when someone buys a car?
Very well can, yeah. So a lot of the new vehicles purchased today come with all sorts of different features that are to help drivers to be safer on the road and to recover in case of a collision, to provide connected services. And all of those services are also dependent on the same kind of telematics technology, which is really just a way of managing a data flow from inside of a car to some back end where the data can be used to create insights and provide services to a driver or owner of the vehicle.
How does that data find its way to Arity?
So at Arity, we have a mission to make transportation safer, smarter, and more useful for everyone. And we work with a whole slew of different markets to take our capabilities and to create value for their businesses. And so in the case of, say, insurance companies, they're trying to help individual customers to benefit from safe driving behaviors and to benefit from that with lower premiums. And Arity helps by being able to collect the data, to originate the meaningful data that can prove to the insurance company that this truly is a safer driver, and to help them to reward them for that. We also work with shared mobility companies, so think car share companies, ride share companies, car subscription companies. Interestingly, these companies have a very similar level of interest in understanding situational driving risk, and so they work with Arity to better understand that risk because that's really important to them as they scale their platforms. And so we're there to help them to understand risk. And whether you're an insurance company or a shared mobility company, ultimately you're in the risk management business. And the first step towards managing risk is understanding it. And that's where we come in.
Can an insurance company besides Allstate use Arity?
For sure. Yeah. Arity has multiple insurance company customers today. That includes all of the Allstate family of insurance companies. There's more than one. Most people understand Allstate or hear Allstate, they think Allstate Insurance Company. But there's Esurance, there's Answer Financial, there's Encompass. And Arity works with all the Allstate companies. But we also work with insurance company outside of the Allstate portfolio. And the first one that we announced was National General. We're excited about that relationship.
Why did Allstate do this?
Well, Allstate is very interested in making transportation safer for the world, too, and has a long history of that. Allstate was very influential and involved in things like seat belts and airbags being made standard equipment in vehicles.
I didn't know that.
So it's very much true, and it's part of the DNA of the company. And so taking a really powerful capability that we have now realized with Arity and offering that to companies outside of the Allstate corporate portfolio just seems natural for a company with that kind of DNA.
So does Arity basically sort all this data and analyze it itself and then provide it to someone?
Yeah, and it's really not really about providing the data to someone. We originate the data, we capture that data, we ingest it, we normalize it, we store it, we filter it, and we make it available for analytics to be done upon that data. And the analytics really just means we take that data and we create insights from it. We turn it into something useful for a customer. And oftentimes, if that customer is an insurance company, it's really helping them to better understand risk so that they can better manage risk. If the customer is a shared mobility company, it's really kind of the same thing. And if the customer is an end consumer, it's really helping them to better understand risk, but also helping them in the case of a collision or something of that nature.
So this new marketplace that I wrote about recently is actually using Arity to be able to look at basically so that insurance companies can market to essentially to drivers. Is that something you're involved in?
Yeah, I think you're referring to the Answer Financial Marketplace,
Yes.
Which is an ad marketplace based on telematics, and we are involved in that. Answer and Arity are working together on the Answer Marketplace, and we're really the score behind the marketplace. And again, that's really about enabling end users, drivers, to benefit from their safe driving behaviors and to make sure that insurance companies know that they're out there. So it really enables those drivers to take advantage of safe driving behaviors and those companies to be able to target them with the offers that are going to enable them to have insurance that reflects those safe behaviors.
Over time, have you gotten any sense that your information actually changes driving behavior?
We do have a little sense of that, but what I will say is that's probably the next real horizon associated with the work that we do. At Arity, through the better part of a decade of doing this work, we've established a real strong credibility in the area of what I'll call telematics and in the area of analytics. And I'll explain that a little bit. When I say telematics, I mean the ability to originate meaningful data from some remote source, whether that's a device or a phone, and to be able to capture that data and store it and normalize it and make it available for analytics. And analytics is where we turn that into an insight. We're really good at both of those things. We've been doing it for a long time. But I think that next horizon is actually affecting meaningful change in behavior. And of course, we're in a position to enable people to take advantage of that meaningful change. And I think that's going to be powerful, and I think it's going to be the next big thing in this area.
Would that be something like letting a driver know that they have too many jackrabbit starts, or something more profound than that?
Well, I think it's that, and I think it's something more profound than that. I think there are, whether it's jackrabbit starts or it's hard braking events, these are sort of established events that people that are accustomed to usage-based insurance or telematics, or even fleet telematics associated with a program like that, they're starting to get a sense for those things. But I think it can be more profound than that. There are things that are more subtle that end users, that drivers may not know about, and we can be really in a good position to help them to understand that.
What would be an example of that?
Well, when we think about it, as these programs began, it was really about how much people drive. And I think people sort of recognize that the more I drive, the more risk I'm assuming. And then we got into how people drive, and that's where you get at things like you described, a jackrabbit start or hard braking. But really, when people drive and where they drive and in what conditions they drive are also really important in understanding their risk. And the interaction of all those variables is really how we determine how risky the situation that they're in is. And we're able to synthesize all of that and to provide that insight back to the end user. And really, again, if you tie it back to what we're here to do, we want to make transportation safer, smarter, and more useful for everyone. We think back to, with all the technology changes in vehicles, they're getting safer, right? They should be getting safer. We should expect to see accidents declining. We should expect to see deaths from auto accidents declining. And we're really seeing the opposite. In 2016, we saw, I think, 40,000 deaths from auto accidents in the United States, and that's up significantly over the last few years. So we really want to get serious about enabling people to understand risk and to be able to avoid situations that might result in something awful like that.
With all of this data, can you tell any indications of why that would happen in the course of a year?
Well, we certainly can tell changes in risk patterns with individuals and on the aggregate. And we can see that by geography. We can see that over the course of the year, so related to just the natural rhythms of the year, weather patterns, et cetera. So yeah, we're definitely in a position to help understand that.
Could you actually detect something such as, hypothetically, drivers, they're going 3 miles an hour faster on average in Texas?
We certainly can. Yes, absolutely. So if you take just the telematics data and then you use other data sets to understand the context of that telematics data, and then you look at it from geographic splits or time splits, Insights like that are pretty easy to tease out.
And then what would you do with that information? Again, this is hypothetically. Would you then bring that to the state legislature or the state, whoever is basically the regulatory body, and say, hey, by the way, your traffic deaths are up, as you know, but here's some statistics about speed that you may not be aware of?
I think that's one application. The way we think about it is we're here to solve the really the tough problems that our customers are trying to solve. And so in the case of government entities who are trying to solve these problems related to traffic accidents and the deaths resulting from traffic accidents, we believe there's all sorts of insights and value we can bring to that conversation. And so if you take the telematics data and understand the trends associated with a particular area of geography relative to the context of that geography, I think they can glean a lot of powerful insights about potentially how to change the infrastructure associated with that area, institute new rules or laws for that area, or even create new incentives for people that will reduce the risk associated with that area.
A particular geography identified that their traffic situation has changed, it's gotten worse. Do they go find you? Because they don't really know the why necessarily, they just know the what.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And we hope they come find us, but frankly, we need to do a good job of letting them know that we're out there. And we're starting to put a lot of emphasis on that now. Again, where we started, this was all about enabling the Allstate Insurance Company to have a telematics-based, usage-based insurance program. But in the course of 10 years, what we've realized is this data has far more powerful applications, and one of them is to improve safety on the roadways for everyone. And so we want those government entities to know that we're here. We can help to make really a safer roadway for everyone through the insights that we can provide.
Ultimately, is every car going to be so-called connected?
Well, I would argue that most cars are connected now anyway, because whether or not they have an embedded technology that provides for a data connection or a device plugged into it, nearly everybody is driving around with a mobile phone, and the mobile phone's connected and can transfer a lot of information that can really be helpful in understanding mobility and understanding mobility risk.
But for the mobile data, doesn't the consumer have to opt in to be able to send data?
Sure. And really, whether it was embedded telematics or a plug-in device, the user really needs to opt in. So I don't think that's any different. And it's like anything else. Consumers will opt in to the extent that they believe they're going to get value from it. So that's not a burden that anyone's going to get away from. We need to create meaningful value for the end user in order to provide the insights that we need to make the roadways safer.
Do you have any sense of what the opt-in rate is these days?
I think it sort of depends on the form factor. If you're talking about one of these embedded telematics systems that comes with buying a new car and has services associated with it, some of that depends on whether you're getting a free subscription period of time. But I think in most cases, you're probably talking significant double-digit opt-ins. If you're looking at insurance companies that are using devices or mobile apps, with customers that are just arriving at that company and getting an insurance offer, you're still significant double-digit opt-in percentages. It's not immaterial. This is significant, and I think the whole world is changing in that direction.
So does it matter if you get everybody, since your numbers are so large, that isn't it projectable anyway, whether a lot of people opt in or not?
Well, there certainly is truth to the fact that once you arrive at a significant portion or percentage, as long as it's representative, then you can derive all sorts of value from that. But it does help us to provide value to each individual if that individual is connected too. So the more people are connected, the more value we can create.
What's the greater value? Is it the information about the individual behavior, or is it the aggregate data of all of your billions of miles driven?
I think it depends on the use case. So I'll go back to we're here to solve problems. And if the problem is best solved by looking at aggregate data to understand mobility trends, then that's really the data that we would use to solve that problem. If it's an individual driver or customer or fleet manager that really wants to look at individual patterns and improve on those individual patterns, then it's really that individual data that you want to look at. So it really depends on the use case.
So would a fleet come to you, say a limo company that has, 50 or 100, 200 cars, whatever, come to you and say, hey, we want to basically improve our driving pattern. Would you take a look at our pattern? And then you'd go and say, it turns out that your people they're not stopping as well at stop signs or something like that. And then they would go then tell their team, their employees, hey, here's something we need to work on collectively.
Yeah, I think that's one way to do it. I think at a high level, If the company wants to work with us to gather insights about their drivers, we can provide those insights to the company, we can provide them to the individual drivers, or we can do both. But just by collecting data from those vehicles and from those drivers, we're going to be able to derive the insights. It's a matter of how do you want to have the discussion. We can do both. So think about it as that fleet manager might get an aggregated view, and they could also break it down and look at individual drivers. And then the individual should be getting some feedback as well, because that goes back to how do they know to affect change that will be meaningful if they're not getting feedback about their individual driving.
Have you heard any feedback of individuals of worrying about Big Brother over their shoulder or being monitored all the time?
Sure. Yeah, I think in this space you always hear about that. But again, I think we operate in a world where people opt in into these services. They opt in to be connected, and they do that if the value proposition is there. And if they don't opt in, they won't be connected. We won't be collecting that data. And we're okay with that too. We do think these things should be optional. We do think it should be transparent. We do think people should really see the value.
So this is totally unrelated, but why do you think everyone doesn't have Easy Pass?
That's a good question. I've had Easy Pass for a long time, and it just makes it easier for me. And I think that's kind of how I think about all these technologies. I do notice that those lines at the coin box are getting shorter and shorter. So I think the opt-in for that program is increasing over time too.
Yeah, it just boggles my mind. So now that you've got all this data, and now there's an ad platform that's basically going to be essentially marketing the information, isn't there a whole lot more information that can be done outside of insurance? For example, to know that good drivers pass by this particular quick service restaurant 5 times a week, something to that effect, that's totally unrelated to insurance.
Oh, yeah, I do think there are those opportunities out there. And I think there's people out there trying to take advantage of those opportunities. For us at Arity, again, our mission is to make transportation safer, smarter, and more useful for everyone. So whether those opportunities sort of fit that mission kind of tells you whether or not we're likely to prioritize it and try to solve it.
And you're doing most of this with APIs, right?
We are. And that really kind of goes back to if you're working with companies that are technology savvy, you want to make working with those companies and integrating with those companies really easy. And APIs are just really the way to do that in the modern world.
So how does that work? What's an example?
Well, if you think about an example of the insights that we provide, a driving score, for example, we originate driving data, we ingest the data, we store the data, and then when a customer of ours, call it an insurance company or call it a rideshare company, call it a car share company, when they want to score, they essentially make a call from their technology to ours. And they use authentication, so we know who they are, we know what data that they have access to, and we answer that call with a score for the particular user ID that they asked for.
So is that pretty much like credit score?
Well, I guess that's a good analogy. Yeah, it is kind of like a credit score. I guess in the case of really looking at risk and driving risk, situational driving risk, historically, credit data has been used to better understand driving risk. And that's kind of in the traditional insurance loss modeling. That's an example of the type of characteristic that's been used in modeling. And really all that stuff, if you lump it together, really talks about who a driver is. And we think of the telematics data as really getting at not who a driver is, but how they drive. And we think this is a better way to understand insurance losses, expected insurance losses. In fact, we know that to be true because we have the data to prove it.
So could an individual come to you and say, hey, my insurance rates are too high, I want to get a lower rate. Can you analyze my driving and give me some tips on what I should do to basically get a better score?
Yeah, we're definitely able to do that. What we would recommend for that individual right now, you mentioned the Answer ad marketplace. Answer is able to offer up a mobile app that has our software in it. A customer could download that mobile app, generate driving data, get some insights from the feedback through the mobile app, improve upon that driving to maximize their opportunity to save, and then Answer can provide them with ads from insurance companies that are really hungry to acquire those safer driving customers and to reward them for that behavior.
So in all of this, is there any artificial intelligence, machine learning being used?
Sure, yeah. All of the predictive models that we use, which essentially is the value that we provide, are derived with machine learning. That's just data science, and that's at the core of what we do at Arity.
I would say just data science. That's a big deal.
Well, I guess when you lead a data science team and you're working for an organization that's grounded in that, maybe we tend to think about it that way. And you're right. I shouldn't take it for granted. I work with an amazingly powerful and smart group of people, and I'm lucky to be able to do that.
So I read in your background, you're also an inventor and you have patents.
I do have a few patents. We're always working on new and interesting things, and when we think those things will create value, we want to protect them.
So what kind of patents do you have?
Well, most of the patents that I have are related to this business that we're in. So it's kind of based on using telematics to improve roadway safety, using telematics to sort of reform what auto insurance means, and using telematics to better serve the individual driver and owners of those vehicles.
So I'm sure you're aware of all the self-driving tests going around in Miami now. They've got pizza being delivered by self-driving Fords, and Toyota just formed a company with $2.8 billion investment to basically advance software for self-driving. Where do you see the evolution of that? Because you've been dealing with connected cars for a long time.
Yeah, well, I guess I see the evolution from where we are to a time at some point in the future where all the cars are self-driving all the time is a long road and a very messy one. And that's why we think that we're in a good position to help kind of make it less messy. I think what we'll see in the near term is you're first going to arrive at a point where all the cars on the road are connected. I'm not saying to each other, but to something. And that really represents a good portion of the next few decades before we get to this point where all the cars are driving themselves. And then, when we arrive at the Jetsons or Blade Runner, when they're all flying. But I think at the point where they're all connected, that's where there's a whole lot of value that can be created. Really to make the roadway safer and more efficient, frankly. So when I say make the transportation safer, smarter, and more useful for everyone, efficiency is a key play there too. And it's not just about the cars, it's about the rest of the transportation ecosystem.
So have you tracked any self-driving cars yet?
We've done some work with self-driving cars, yes.
So how do they score?
Well, you kind of have to score them on a different rubric, and I don't think we have enough self-driving cars in the wild for us to make a good judgment on them relative to humans at this point.
So will you be able to ultimately do that, do you think? Actually measure the self-driving car versus a human-driven car?
Oh, sure. Yeah, and I think more importantly, with self-driving technologies, there are things that we can do to help make them even better than people expect them to be right now. A lot of the autonomous technologies are really more dependent on, I'll just refer to it as kind of near field sensors, whether that's LiDAR or radar or camera technology. It's kind of looking in the horizon immediately around the vehicle to better understand how to operate. And with some of our data and some of our technologies and some of our insights, we can help an autonomous vehicle to understand what's happening in sort of one horizon beyond that, because we take all of the data that we have, which includes historical claims data. We geocode that claims data to understand where those claims occurred, under what conditions, and we can provide that to an autonomous vehicle so that they can anticipate what that next horizon is going to be.
So what bothers you these days?
Oh, what bothers me these days? The modern music, Chuck. I'm kind of a guy that likes anything from like 1965 to 1974. I'm obsessed with, but I don't really like what's being created today.
In terms of roadblocks for what you're trying to accomplish, do you see anything in your way?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about roadblocks per se, but it bothers me that with all this increase in technology that's making cars supposedly safer, that we're seeing deaths on the roadway increase. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that, but one of the things that I think you'd recognize and most of your listeners would recognize, if you look around on the road today, you're going to see a high percentage of those drivers with at night a blue light lighting up their face, and during the daytime literally holding their phone up in front of their face while driving. And I think that's probably related to this increase in deaths on the roadway that we're seeing. That bothers me. And I think that's something that we should really do something about. Another thing that bothers me is we don't have efficiency between all the different aspects of the transportation ecosystem. I'm here in Chicago. I commute to Chicago from the suburbs. We've got trains, we've got elevated trains, we've got buses, we've got taxis, we've got shared mobility, and of course we have personal transportation, personal automobiles. And to me, it seems like these systems are so disconnected that they just run inefficiently. And there's an opportunity for us to connect these systems and to use things like dynamic pricing, frankly, to learn from some of these shared mobility companies on using things that are called surge pricing, which I think have gotten a bad name. But what it really relates to is having pricing relate to demand. And I think that can create a lot of inefficiency, that can create inefficiencies in the transportation ecosystem.
So how would you even start with that? That's a massive concept.
It is a massive concept, but I think you can start with the individual. So very recently here in Chicago, I read about Metro looking to kind of change how they construct their fares. So as an example, somebody who's coming from a far out suburb may pay less per mile to travel into the city than someone who's closer to the city. And I think that's reflective of how crowded it is and what the demand is closer to the city versus people coming from, say, 30 miles away. That makes sense to me. And I think we can see that start to happen in these individual modes of transportation. And then over time, as you connect them to each other, you can start to really better manage flow and improve the efficiency of moving people in and out of the cities.
So does that typically, in your view, is that going to start with one transportation segment, say a train company or a bus company or whatever?
I think it will. And I think we've seen that already. Again, I think some people don't really like the thought of surge pricing, and I think the name doesn't really help that. But if you think about how demand-based pricing creates efficiencies, we've already seen that happen with shared mobility. So if it starts to happen with things like commuter trains, and it starts to happen with even things like road tolls, it can really start to balance flow and really make a much more efficient transportation system.
Ultimately, is Arity going to track things more than cars moving?
Well, I think to some extent we do that now, Chuck. So with our mobile software, we're able to understand with a pretty high degree of certainty whether or not someone is in a vehicle or on a train or in a bus. And when I say vehicle, I mean their own personal car, or on a train or in a bus or even in a plane or a boat. And that's really part of our mission to basically understand mobility beyond just the personal automobile.
I was thinking more in relation to, in addition to that, to sensors that are placed somewhere. We know that some of the self-driving tests, for example, have sensors on roads so that they'll be connecting to the cars, at least in a short-term play. But they're going to be tens of billions of sensors, as you know. Any thoughts of connecting to any of those?
Yeah, so I think we would love to connect to all of the infrastructure sensors to the extent that it will help us to make transportation safer for everyone. And I think that's a realistic expectation. The infrastructure takes longer to develop. And so I think we sort of expect and look forward to a day where there are all these sensors, that the vehicles are all communicating with each other and communicating with the infrastructure. But boy, there's a whole lot of opportunity right in front of us with the fact that most of these cars are connected either through embedded telematics or the phones inside of them.
So lastly, what's the good news about the future?
Well, I think we're coming to a realization. And the realization is that the personal transportation system is broken. And that may seem weird as an answer to your question about the good news. But the good news is we're increasingly aware of this, that cars are really only used about 4 or 5% of the time. And what that means is there's massive inefficiencies. And if we can address massive inefficiencies, what we can do is create real value for people. And that's what we're all about doing.
Thank you, Grady Irey, and thank you all for listening to the Voices of the Internet of Things.
Thank you, Chuck.